todos y bienvenidos a MindSurf, un espacio creado por y para psiconautas, en donde conversamos sobre las profundas implicaciones de la experiencia psicodélica, los misterios de la conciencia y la naturaleza de la realidad, junto con importantes personajes, investigadores, autores y activistas, que nos ayudarán a comprender mejor estos fenómenos. Gracias por estar con nosotros y hoy le tenemos una gran entrevista. Nuestro invitado del día de hoy es Anthony Peake, escritor británico que se ocupa del estudio de la conciencia humana. Su primer libro, Somos Inmortales, la visión de la ciencia sobre la vida después de la muerte, fue publicado en el 2006 y desde entonces ha desarrollado sus propias ideas junto con la exploración de las más vanguardistas investigaciones en su campo. Es coautor de La mente inmortal, la ciencia y la continuidad de la conciencia más allá del cerebro, libro escrito junto al 2 veces nominado al Premio Nobel de la Paz, el profesor Irving Laszlo. Es además autor de una de las mejores biografías sobre el autor de culto de ciencia ficción, Philip K. Dick, titulada A Life of Philip K. Dick, The Man Who Remembered the Future, además de haber escrito otras interesantes obras donde aborda el tema de los estados alterados de conciencia, como The Infinite Mindfield y Opening the Doors of Perception, en donde retoma y actualiza el trabajo del gran Aldous Huxley. Su más reciente libro, The Hidden Universe, An Investigation into Non-Human Intelligences, es uno de los mejores trabajos sobre visitantes de otros mundos, donde analiza los ancestrales encuentros con dioses, ángeles, demonios, duendes, fantasmas, ovnis extraterrestres y otros seres cuyos encuentros son facilitados a través del uso de sustancias como el DMT, 5-MeO-DMT, ayahuasca y LSD. Si son seguidores del trabajo de escritores como Terence McKenna, Robert Anton Wilson, Grant Hancock o Jacobo Greenberg, no se pueden perder esta entrevista. Muchas gracias por estar con nosotros y por favor ayúdenos a compartir esta información.
Okay, so thanks so much for agreeing to do this interview with MindSurf. We really appreciate it. You're actually one of our favorite authors since you put together so many important topics in a very elegant way, finding answers to some of the deepest questions about human experience. So we hope we can talk a little bit about what we think are some of the highlights of your work.
Okay, no, that sounds wonderful.
Okay, so throughout your excellent books, you have studied the subject of consciousness and the nature of reality quite deeply. And so we would like to start this interview talking about the subject of consciousness. The current reductionist materialist paradigm argues that consciousness is just a product of brain activity. However, your work suggests that its nature is actually non-local. And so can you explain to us what this would mean and what evidence you have to support it?
Okay, one of the biggest questions is something called the hard question of science. And it was first put together and first questioned in 1999 at a conference at the University of Arizona when a young Australian philosopher by the name of David Chalmers stood up and said that we have two major issues in terms of our scientific understanding of consciousness. The first one is the easy problem, or the less hard problem, which is how we can match a one-to-one relationship between experience and thoughts and what the brain does. So knowing what parts of the brain switch on and off when certain things take place in the brain. We can do that. That's the easy problem. The hard problem is understanding how effectively inanimate matter, which effectively it is, your brain is made up of electricity reacting with chemicals. It can create Regina, myself, all living creatures, all beings that perceive. What creates the inner world? Because you can do a map of the brain, but you can never actually understand exactly where consciousness is. Now, from there is then the ongoing problem of various other things to do with how the brain functions, like there's something called the binding problem within the brain. And that is how it is that although different parts of the brain are processing external stimuli in different parts of the brain, and the information is coming from different parts of the body, we have a feeling of simultaneity. We have a feeling that everything is happening at this moment. This is called the binding problem. This is again something that modern science isn't even at first base at trying to understand. But then in terms of how our own inner world, the visions that we see, the way in which the visual system works, the way we inwardly can create a facsimile of external reality within the brain, which we are all doing now. Most people work under the assumption that when I see something, my brain is like a camera, and my brain works like a camera, and all it does is the vision comes in through my eyes, and there's kind of a little screen at the back, and it's processed there. But this is not how it works. What technically takes place is the brain takes the information coming from the retina, turns it into an electrical signal, which is then recreated into a three-dimensional image of external reality in the deepest, darkest part of the brain, which is the visual cortex, which sits right at the back of the brain, and recreates literally the external world. Now, the belief that there is a one-to-one relationship between what you see and what is out there is actually called naive realism by consciousness studies experts, because it's been naive to believe that what we see internally is what is externally out there. So the great problem is, how does electricity reacting with chemicals create this whole inner world, create your thoughts, your dreams, your hopes, your fears, creates emotions such as love or hate, creates even the term qualia, the intensity of the color red, or pain. All of these things do not exist in external three-dimensional reality. They are created by something seemingly within the brain. Now, my final point on this is one of the major problems that science has with the idea that brain creates consciousness is a series of experiments that were done by a guy called, I think it was Tal Shamrut, a few years ago, whereby there's a form of worm called planaria. And these worms are quite interesting in the sense that if you cut their head off, they will grow a new one, which means they will grow a new brain. Now, planaria worms really like liver. It's really quite strange. They don't know why, but these worms really like eating liver. So what they did was they took a group of planaria worms and they over a period of time, they trained them to be able to find their way through a short maze to find their way to where the liver is. No, that's not what they did. No, I'll tell a lie. What they did was, it was more subtle than that. Planaria worms hate bright light. Okay? So if you have a lump of liver and you put it under bright light, the planaria worms will avoid the liver. But over a period of time, they trained a group of planaria worms to get over their fear of the light and go in and discover where the liver is and eat it. Okay? What they then did was they cut the heads off the planaria worms, making sure there was no brain function of any description left, and a new brain was grown by the planaria worms. The planaria worms were still able to find their way through and had the interest in liver overruling their fear of light. Now, this is technically impossible in all modern ways of understanding science, that the brain creates consciousness, whether it's the consciousness of a planaria worm or whether it is human beings. Clearly, this is totally counter to that. Also, there has been evidence over the years of individuals that have been found that have had functioned perfectly well. There was one young man in the UK who functioned extremely well, got a degree in mathematics, died tragically in his 20s, and when the autopsy took place, he virtually had no brain at all. All he had was the area around the edges of the brain. How did he possibly function if most of his brain was missing? Unless the brain is a receiver of consciousness. So the evidence is powerfully there. It's just modern science is in denial because we are so wedded to this materialist reductionist model that we cannot let go, even when the evidence is screaming at us. Clearly there is, and a series, it's quite fascinating actually, a series of experiments has recently been done. I think it was the University of Sussex, quite close to where I'm talking from you now, in Brighton. And what they did was they discovered some very, very curious things to do with how the brain works. And they found that if you scan somebody's brain with an fMRI scanner, a scanner that can actually gauge what's going on in the brain, and then they had these individuals take psilocybin, magic mushrooms, and when they took psilocybin, what was incredible was that the psilocybin switched parts of the brain off. In other words, you'd expect it to be switching areas on because people see things and have hallucinations when they take psilocybin. But the opposite took place. It was as if the psilocybin was actually stopping the brain, acting as a barrier to a lot of these perceptions. In other words, the perceptions are there always. The brain stops the information coming through to consciousness rather than facilitates it. So you then go back to the idea that the brain is an attenuator, and you go back to the ideas of Henri Bergson, C.D. Broad, various philosophers in the 1920s and 1930s, and even earlier, as I say, with Henri Bergson, arguing that the brain, in fact, cuts things out. The brain is a modulator to allow us to exist within this reality, whatever this reality is, whatever this simulation is.
Okay.
Yeah.
So in one hand, phenomena like the near-death experiences and out-of-body experiences can occur naturally and spontaneously in some people. But on the other hand, what happens when these bizarre experiences are induced through the use of psychedelic substances? I mean, science always talk about the neurochemical changes in the brain and that sort of things, but actually tell us very little about what does this really means for consciousness. In your book, Opening the Doors of Perception, you expand and update some of the ideas that Aldous Huxley had about these experiences. What are your thoughts about consciousness and psychedelics?
Consciousness psychedelics are something that absolutely fascinates me. I regularly attend, every 2 years, there's a fascinating event that takes place over here in the UK called Breaking Convention, which happens at the University of Greenwich. And you have some of the world's leading researchers and thinkers on psychedelics, on hallucinogenic substances, entheogens, DMT, ayahuasca, these kind of things. And in the conference, we discuss in great detail the relationship between perception and these mind-changing substances. And the issue is, what is taking place when that takes place? For instance, you pointed out before something I've been interested in for many, many years, the near-death experience. Now, again, with the near-death experience, there's been, in 2017, there were a series of experiments that took place at the University of Michigan. And there was a young Japanese-American researcher called Jimo Borjigin. And she did a series of experiments. Initially, she did experiments with rats. And what they did was the rats were killed, which was a terrible thing to do effectively, but they needed to do it for the research. And they discovered that around about 10 to 15 seconds after the rat had died, there was suddenly a massive surge in brain activity, as if the brain was suddenly processing information from somewhere else. And Borjigin and her associates came to the conclusion that was actually the first time that they were able to measure what we would know as the near-death experience, because technically the rats were dead, but the brain suddenly surged into activity after it should have been ceased to be doing anything at all. Then they discovered something even more sensational, because you will find that most critics of the mind-body problem, most people who are critics of the idea that there's anything other than the brain creating consciousness, will argue that one of the major arguments that's used is dimethyltryptamine in the brain and DMT in the brain. And they say there's no evidence for DMT in the brain, everything else, blah, blah, blah. What in fact happened, Borjigin and her researchers in 2017 found for the first time dimethyltryptamine in the pineal gland of live rats. So for the first time, dimethyltryptamine had been found in the brain of a live mammal. And of course, the reason they use rats' brains is because there's fairly similar correlates between how a rat's brain works and how a human being's brain works. So suddenly we have evidence that DMT is in there. Now, if DMT is inside the brain and the pineal gland, it had to have got there somehow. And the logic is it was somehow created within the pineal gland. And there's a strong argument to say the pineal gland, and there's growing evidence that it probably synthesizes from melatonin, DMT. Now, if this is the case, it explains things such as the trace amine-associated receptors in the brain, which for many years neurologists have been completely confused as to why these things exist, because they do not react with any other neurotransmitters. They react with DMT. So therefore, suddenly we have this idea that consciousness and is DMT our consciousness regulator? Is it our reality modulator? And is it what it creates the interface between whatever consciousness is within the brain or outside of the brain and whatever external reality is? So we're getting some very, very interesting areas here as to what really is taking place when we talk about the mind-body problem. You know, am I just my body or am I something greater? So near-death experiences, out-of-the-body experiences, lucid dreaming, remote viewing, all of these things, there's growing evidence that people can go elsewhere, and a consciousness can move around in the external environment rather than be brain-based. And if there's, you know, I will talk about something later on that I have actual powerful evidence that people can perceive things outside of their bodies and perceive things that they cannot possibly see normally through their normal senses.
So talking about, because we touched on the subject of DMT. So historically, psychedelic experiences have been the stage for all kinds of encounter with non-human entities. People always ask themselves if these beings are real or imaginary. Mainstream science says that these supposed encounters are nothing but simple hallucination, but like you said, that doesn't really tell us anything, right? Calling it a hallucination doesn't explain what a hallucination is and what's going on. So what have you found about the nature of hallucinations, and what are the implications of these kind of experiences?
Okay, I call this the label theory of science. The label theory of science is that if you are unsure about something, create a label, create a name, create a term to describe it, and therefore you've described it. So in other words, the more esoteric sounding term, you know, nice Latin term is normally good, or a nice term from Greek, makes the general public realize that science has got it sussed. And one of the classic examples of this are hallucinations. In that science says, oh, it is just an hallucination, as if that has explained it. Now, again, I'd strongly suggest anybody who's interested, and if it's in Spanish, very much check it out. One of the world's leading psychiatric writers was a guy called Oliver Sacks, who died 2 or 3 years ago. And one of the final books he wrote was a book called Hallucinations. And in this book, he discusses in great detail a series of hallucinatory states of mind, from Charles Bonnet syndrome to general hallucinations. And he said, we have not even the first idea of how hallucinations are created in the brain. Because we use the argument that if I have an hallucination, and the general definition of an hallucination is, in simple terms, I'm seeing something or perceiving something that nobody else is perceiving or seeing. In other words, it's something just I'm perceiving. But the whole of our whole sensory experience is exactly the same as that. You know, you can't experience something that somebody else is experiencing. So one could argue that whole sensory experience is an hallucination by that definition anyway. But we won't even go that far. Well, let's go roll back and say, okay, let's look at this in greater detail then. So if I have an hallucination, I'm on my own. If, say, we share an hallucinatory experience, the two of us, science has an explanation for that as well. They call it a folie à deux. The idea that two people are sharing an hallucination in some magical way yet to be explained by science, because science is in denial about telepathy. So how they can argue that an explanation of two people experiencing the same hallucination is brought about by some form of telepathy, which also they don't agree exists, they paint themselves into an absolute corner because they're using one impossibility to explain another impossibility. Then, if you get a large people having an hallucination, and for instance, I always use the example here of the incident at Fatima, when the sun spun in the sky, and all the people saw the sins, and tens of thousands of people saw this event take place collectively. Is that considered to be a genuine event in external reality? No. Apparently, it's just mass hysteria. But then again, they never explain how the infection of mass hysteria jumps from person to person non-locally, and how everybody agrees they're seeing the same thing. So they want it always up. They want their explanations to stand out, but their explanations do not hold water. Now, in terms of hallucinations, it's profoundly important to think more consistently about what an hallucination is. If I hallucinate, say, an entity sitting in a chair in front of me, there are two hallucinations going on here. There's the hallucination of the thing I can see in the chair, but there's also an hallucination of exclusion, because the creature in the chair, I cannot see the back of the chair anymore because I'm seeing something in front of it, if that makes sense. So there are two hallucinations going on here. Now, Celia Green and Charles McCrory, who were still are two very important researchers in the terms of hallucinations and out of the body experiences and such like, call this the metachoric experience. And they argue that we externalize, we project outwards a model of reality into three-dimensional reality. And all of us are projecting this out into that reality all the time. So therefore, hallucinations actually occur within the brain, within the external model of what external reality is. Now, if this is the case, then we start getting a much better picture of what an hallucination is. Now, then the question arises, and it was a very pertinent question, that if we encounter entities in these states, what is the nature of those entities? And again, I have associates of mine, there's massive research being done at the moment at the Imperial College, London University. And there's been money put up by a guy called Anton Bilton, who's a multimillionaire. And he's putting money up for researchers doing doctoral and postdoctoral research to take, under control conditions, intravenously take DMT, dimethyltryptamine. And one of my associates is a postdoctoral researcher by the name of Carl H. Smith. And Carl is working on this at the moment. And Carl was telling me of an event that took place a few months ago, where he took the intravenous DMT, he went into the DMT cage, the world that you go into, and he found himself in the DMT cage. And as he's in this place, an entity comes over to him, looks him straight in the eye and pokes him and says, "You shouldn't be doing it this way. This is the wrong way to do it." He then found himself coming out of the DMT zone, coming to. A week later, he takes another group of DMT, goes and finds himself in the same location, in the same DMT zone, and the same entity came over again and said, "I told you last time, you shouldn't be doing it this way." Now, as Carl has said to me, that creature was not part of my subconscious. It was telling me something that I didn't want to hear, because he was wanting to hear, yes, no, this is the way to do it. DMT is the route. So it couldn't have been a manifestation of his subconscious, but it clearly recognized him. I have evidence of people in out-of-the-body experiences who have encountered other people in out-of-body experience scenarios, that they have subsequently met those people and they have discussed the fact that they've met in an out-of-body experience. So here we have, again, an hallucination that's being shared. And the only reason we consider this reality to be real is we call it consensual reality. Again, because we agree, if I see a red car driving down the road here, and you see a red car driving down the road, we agree consensually that that is evidence that the external world is real. But what if two people or three people in taking DMT experience the same stimuli? That suggests that there is no difference in the reality between that external world and this world. Now, for example, there's a friend of mine and she is a lucid dreamer and she was living in Japan. And when she was having her lucid dream, she was living in a hotel in the lucid dream. And she used to leave the hotel and go underneath the hotel. And underneath the hotel was a shopping center. And in the shopping center, it was in Japan, so she would notice, she's a Canadian, but she would notice any of the faces in the shopping center who are not Japanese. And she noticed this girl who was European. She noticed her regularly. She then leaves Japan and comes back to the UK. She's living in London. She walks across the street one day and sees the girl in her dream. They recognize each other. They start discussing where they could have known each other from. And the girl said, she said, "Do I know you from?" And then she said, "You lived in the hotel above the shopping center. I used to see you in the shopping center." Now, this is impossible. Now, of course, they will just turn around and say, the plural of anecdote is not proof. So it's just anecdotal, it's not evidence. But this evidence happens time and time again. And I'll give you one case that is the most amazing case I have come across, and it was witnessed by other people. There's a researcher I know called Graham Nichols. And Graham Nichols has very, very profound out-of-the-body experiences. He has done for many, many years since he was a child. And Graham contacted me because in my book, The Out-of-Body Experience, I argue that out-of-body experiences are actually going internally, not externally in the external world. He contacted me and said, no, He said, I know it may sound impossible, but I've had a series of experiences whereby I know. And he gave an example. And he said, when he was very, very young, he was lying in bed, and then suddenly he saw, in a hypnagogic state, he saw a street sign. He sort of saw it in his vision. He saw a road sign with the name of a street. And I don't know if you've ever been into London, but areas of London are like NW3, SW12, and these kind of things. They're northwest and everything. So they're names of locations. And a street sign will always have what area of London it's on the bottom. And he sees this and the sign and reads the location. He then looks up in this dream state and he sees a sign outside a shop which has a newspaper headline on it. And he knew there was a news agent there. He then comes to, and then he checks up on the map of London, and he finds this street actually exists, although he had never been there, had never heard of it. He took himself up there to find the sign exactly as he believed it to be in the vision, and then saw the news agent. The news agent. So he knew that what he'd seen was externally out there. Many years later, he's doing a training course. He's training people. As he's training people, he suddenly feels his legs go strange and he falls to the floor. And then he finds himself in a jungle. And he's walking through the jungle, and he said, I could feel the heat on my hands, and there was a large plants, and I spread the plants apart, and I stepped out, and I was in the corner of Old Compton Street and Wardour Street in Soho in London. And he's standing there thinking, I cannot believe what I'm seeing. And what he then does is somebody runs past him, and he feels the air displacement as he runs past, and he looks down the street, and as he looks down the street, there's a huge explosion in a pub, in a bar, and people are coming out covered in blood. He then hears voices, and the voices are calling him, and they're saying, Graham, are you okay? And it's the people in the lecture theatre calling him back into our reality. He then finds himself raising out of his body. He comes back to his reality, comes to, and the first thing he said to the group of people was, there's going to be a terrorist attack in London. And he gave the exact location. 5 days later, there was a bomb attack in a pub called the Admiral Duncan. The Admiral Duncan in the centre of London, in Soho, in exactly the location. He has 5 or 6 people who have signed affidavits to say that he saw this and he described it. That is inexplicable. It was a precognitive out-of-the-body experience. Wow. Because he wasn't just perceiving this time, he was perceiving the future.
That's amazing. And so while being on this subject, I would like to ask about synchronicities.
Okay.
What do you, I mean, there's a lot of theories on what they are. I would love to know your take on this.
Synchronicities have been following me around ever since I started writing my books. And I find synchronicities, my little group of readers, we meet up on a regular basis. And we've got so used to the synchronicities now that we just follow them. You just go with them. Now, of course, the scientific explanation for synchronicities, they have explanations for everything. Not that these explanations actually hold water, but they have explanations. And the explanations for synchronicities are going to be something called confirmation bias. You know, in the sense that you're looking for the coincidences. So something occurs and you associate it with something else and with something else. Okay, I'd like these people who do this to explain this one. In 1990, about 2003, 2004, I was researching material for my first book. And I needed to research a particular book called Man and Time, written by an English writer called J.B. Priestley, who I've subsequently written a book about. Okay. But at that time, I knew Priestley's work generally, but not a great deal. And I needed a copy of this book, Man and Time. Went to my local library to discover there were no copies available. So I had to order it from the British Library in Boston Spa in the north of England. I then had to wait for a week or two for the book to be delivered back at the library. So already we have an arbitrary thing taking place because it could have been delivered at any day and any period of time. Okay, so bear that in mind. I then get a phone call one day and the library says your copy of Man and Time has been delivered. Okay, so I go up to the library and I pick the book up and I bring it back with me. Now, I can actually, in a second, I'll go downstairs and get this book because I can actually show you the book because I now have my own copy of this. So I then went to the library one day arbitrarily, picked the book up, brought it back home. I then left it in my study and didn't read it for about a week. I had other things to read. I'm going to bed one night, and on my way to bed, I think I need something to read. I go into my study, I pick the book up, and I take it to bed with me. I'm flicking through the pages at random. I'm not trying to read any pages, and a page opens in front of me. I start reading down the page, and it is J.B. Priestley trying to describe the relativity of time, according to Einsteinian physics. And the idea that when you're looking at a star, you're looking at a star that is hundreds of light years away. And he particularly, and this is particularly intriguing now from when we're speaking now, by the way, because he particularly talked about the star Betelgeuse, okay? Now, as you know, Betelgeuse is the star at the moment they think is going to explode. I don't know if you know about this, okay? So this is weird in itself. But the reason he chose this was that he'd picked to use a quotation from a book that had been written in 1957 or 58. He was writing it in 1963. And it's a book called Relativity for the Layman. And it was written by a guy called Coleman. And in it, Coleman says, imagine that on the night of the 17th of March, 2000, there is an explosion on the star Betelgeuse. I'm sitting there reading this, and I turn around to my wife, who's next to me in bed, and I said, what year is it? And she goes, it's 2000. And I said, what's the date today? She said, it's the 17th of March. I said, what time of day is it? She said, it's the evening. And I said, you're a mathematician, you're a statistician. What is the chance of me, with all those random events, reading that 280-page book? Coleman could have picked any date in the whole history of humanity. He could have picked a time of day specifically. It was specific to the time of day, to the date, to the year that I was reading it.
Wow,
Now that to me is extraordinary. You cannot even begin to calculate. I wasn't looking for that.
Yeah.
And these things, when I was writing my first book, these things happened time and time again. The coincidences just became crazy. Like crazy ridiculous. Because a few days later, my wife was getting so fed up with this and these coincidences that she doesn't believe any of it. We were visiting my brother-in-law in Cheltenham, a town in the south of England. And we're in this secondhand bookshop with books piled high everywhere. And my wife turns around to me and she says, you know, this synchronicity nonsense you're talking about, that you're finding things that are just happening. She said, what book? Here we are in a bookshop. It's totally random. There's no order to the books. What book do you want at the moment? And I said, do you know what I think I'd really need? A biography of William Blake. And she went, oh, for God's sake. And it was right in her eye line. She picked it up and she threw it across the room and stormed out of the bookshop. That is how powerful synchronicities are.
Well, all this is amazing. Going back a little bit, you point before the implications of the hallucinations and this shared experience in dreams. And all of this raises some intriguing questions about the possibility that the psychedelic substances and these dream states are actually allowing people's consciousness to go to some kind of real places, to some sort of alternate dimension or universe. What do you think about these possibilities?
The evidence is growing all the time in terms of alternate universes. Again, it's to do with, of all things, it's to do with black holes. Now, just before he died, Stephen Hawking wrote a paper with a guy called Frank Hartle, who is a CERN researcher. And they were discussing certain evidence to do with what happens with information on the edge of black holes. Now, a black hole, if the universe is an enclosed system, which we believe it to be, nothing can be lost in an enclosed system. Energy can be converted. The second law of thermodynamics, things can only be converted into something else. And they postulated what would take place if I threw a computer into a black hole, because a computer's full of information. And the black hole would just destroy that information. It would be lost forever. But that technically cannot happen. And Hawking discovered that there is something, black holes don't suck everything into them. There's something called Hawking radiation, which is given off by a black hole. And they believe that Hawking radiation actually is pure information. Not only that, but can you imagine from the first moments of the Big Bang, the universe is expanding outwards like a balloon being inflated. So 13.8 billion years ago, whatever it is, the Big Bang. And for 13.8 billion light years either side, well, actually, it'd be greater than that because hyperinflation took place in the first moments of the Big Bang, so it's bigger than that, but expands outwards. So it's like we exist on the inside of a huge balloon. They believe that the edge of the inside surface of the balloon, the inside surface of the universe, has literally an incredible number of small Planck squares. The Planck length is the smallest length possibly known. It's that you cannot get, it's the smallest amount of space. Space ceases to exist after that time. And they said, imagine a Planck square, which is a Planck length squared, and each one of them contains one bit of information. Okay. They then calculated how many bits of information they think that would contain. And then they calculated how many bits of information they think they would need to recreate a universe of our size. The figures match. They're exactly the same, which suggests that this reality is not what we think it is. It's holographic. It's holographic in nature. Now, again, people will be turning around to me and saying, oh, you know, I can hear the cynics out there and the skeptics listening to this going, oh, this is utter nonsense. And what I say to them is, really, look up the word of a guy called Walmandakana, who I think is Brazilian. There is a guy called Jacob Bekenstein, who recently died, who is an Israeli researcher and quantum physicist. And also a guy called Craig Hogan, who works at the Perimeter Institute in Ontario in Canada. These guys have been working on this. There was an article about 10 years ago in Scientific American. The cover of Scientific American had, "Is the universe a hologram?" So they are taking it very, very seriously. In fact, Craig Hogan at the moment is doing research trying to find the pixelation of space. Now, we all know that there are some very strange things about the nature of reality and how we perceive it. Now, so if this is some form of simulation, then suddenly the whole argument of what exactly her hallucination starts to get rather strange, because research has shown that there are certain things about the brain we don't understand. I was mentioning the binding problem earlier on. The other thing that is of great confusion is, where are memories in the brain? A guy called Carl Pribram spent most of his career trying to find the location of what he called the engrams in the brain, where memory is. We know where memory can be processed because we know it's something to do with the amygdala, it's something to do with near the temporal lobes of the brain. But that's where it's processed. It's not where it's located. Now, it is believed that memory is spread all across the brain. It seems to be that it is, again, non-local. It seems to be everywhere in the brain, which suggests that memory works holographically. This is why we can instantaneously remember things. It's because rather like you can find anything on a CD-ROM, you know, by just doing a search. You don't have to do it like an analog thing. You can do it digitally. This is the same thing with memory. And they think that the brain works on holographic principles. Now, again, a guy called David Bohm did a lot of work on this because David Bohm argued that reality is holographic. So if the brain works on holographic principles, we have a hologram processing a hologram. So suddenly it starts to get very intriguing, particularly because holograms, if you take a holographic image and you smash it into smaller pieces, you would naturally assume, like a normal photograph, that each part of the image would just be a bit of the image. Each bit would contain a little bit of the image. It doesn't. Each part of a smashed holographic image contains a denuded whole picture, which means that the whole is contained in the parts and the parts are contained in the whole. So we have suddenly this kind of rooted, mysterious universe that seems to reflect upon itself. in some way, and that in some very, very profoundly important way, consciousness brings about the reality that's external to us. There's something called the collapse of the wave function in quantum physics. The idea that in some way the act of measurement makes a subatomic particle choose to be in one location or another. And if that particle is not observed, it can be statistically anywhere in the universe. And the act of observation makes that subatomic particle be in one place or another. Okay? Now, if that is then extrapolated, it suggests that the act of measurement needs a measurer. The act of measurement needs an observer to know that an act of measurement has taken place. So in which case, we're now coming to the point that we as observers create the external reality we perceive. And that is why things like coincidences and synchronicities and everything else take place, because in some way we are creating it as we go through it. Now, again, Stephen Hawking and Frank Hartle came up with something called the top-down hypothesis of quantum physics. And this is that statistically, anything that can happen is already encoded into the 0 point field, into the information field we exist within. Every decision you make and I make collapses a universe to accommodate that decision I've just made. So in which case we all go through our own individual universes, but we all overlap and we all interface. So at the moment we are creating, the three of us and our listeners are all creating this universe, which I call the egregorial. It's an egregore, it's a brain created digital reality. And we are drawing up this information from an information field. So I think that when we talk about hallucinations, we are getting it completely wrong. Everything is information. Therefore, hallucinations are not out there or in there. Everything is brain created. So mind creates matter, not matter creating mind. And this is going to be the next big paradigm change. And I think psychologists, and I think quantum physicists particularly, because quantum physics now is so damn near philosophy, it's untrue. So we're getting to the point now where we're realizing that our paradigm is creaking. We haven't got all the answers. 94% of the universe is missing. It's either dark matter or dark energy. We don't know what dark matter or dark energy is, but we know it exists. We don't know how the brain creates consciousness. Could it be that these things are all related in some way? And what we're doing is we're not joining the dots. That's what I'm trying to do.
That was like a really great answer. We touched upon a lot of the things we wanted to hear in this interview. So
sorry.
Yeah, that was really special. So the one thing that I don't want to miss a chance to talk about is the deja vu.
Right. You've asked me this before. Sorry. Sorry.
Yeah. So okay. So considering the fact that that this were to be a simulation, what do you personally believe is the purpose of this simulation? Is the game would be to, like, if we realize that it's a simulation and we still like can't get out of it, so would the point of all would be learning how to play it? Or what is your personal take on this?
Excellent question. Really, really good question. And it leads into my overall hypothesis, which is called cheating the ferryman. Okay. Do you remember the ancient Greeks? When somebody died, they would place a tiny coin called an obolus, and they'd place it underneath the tongue of the dead person. The reason the coin was there was that the dead person would become what was known as a shade, like a spirit, and they'd find themselves in a misty place with a river in front of them. And then out of the mists would come Charon the boatman. And Charon would come, and they'd have to pay him the obolus in order for him to ferry them across the river Styx, or the river Acheron, to the land of the dead, Hades. Okay? I think you cheat the ferryman. I don't think we ever pay the ferryman his obolus. He gets cheated out of his oboli. Okay? And the reason I believe this is it's even within ancient Greek myths. I'm hopefully going to be recreating Plato's cave in Greece this summer. Some of my books are now going into Greek. My Greek publisher is very keen for us to reproduce what we called Escaping Plato's Cave, which was an event we did last year. Myself and a group of other people. But in ancient Greek myth, what would happen is when you cross the river Styx and you were in the land of the dead, you were given the opportunity of making a choice. And it's not that well known, this, but you were given the choice of drinking the river, the waters of a river called the Lethe, Lethe. And the Lethe is known as the river of forgetfulness. And what it did was, when you drank the waters of the Lethe, they washed all your previous memories of all your previous life. They would just wash them away and they disappeared. And when that happened, you were allowed to go back across the river and live your life again, forgetting the fact of who you are and that you've lived it before. I believe this is what really happens. I believe that what takes place at the final moments of life, as you're dying, the brain releases a group of chemicals. Initially, I thought it was a substance called glutamate. But I now believe it's a mixture of glutamate and endogenous internally generated DMT. And what this does is, we know that glutamate does certain things. We know it slows down time. So whenever you've had an accident or a shock, or you're in a car crash, you know, people say, it slowed down for me. It became incredibly slow. Okay? That's the glutamate kicking in. It's a survival thing. It helps you orientate yourself and get around the dangers. But I believe, and there's evidence of this, that at the final points of life when somebody's dying, glutamate floods the brain. So it starts to slow down. But it starts to slow down to such an extent that time just, and I've written a book on this called The Labyrinth of Time. So I do the science of this. Again, there's nothing I say that's not science. Subjectively, the final few seconds of somebody's life doubles every second. So every second, there is a doubling for them subjectively. So if you do the maths and know something like, there's something called Zeno's paradox and Zeno's bisection paradox, that if you double something all the time, you never get to the end of it. You never get to the point of death, because time, you're in smaller and smaller bits. It's like a frog in the middle of a pool on a lily, and the frog can jump, and the pool is 6 feet across, and the frog can jump 3 feet, but its next jump is 1.5 feet, and its next jump is half of that, and half of that, and half of that. You very quickly realize the frog will never get to the end of the pool. And this is the same with life. We fall out of time. And what did we fill that time with? Your past life. Do you remember people, when they have near-death experiences, turn around and say, my life flashed before my eyes? I say that happens in a near-death experience. In a real death experience, that doesn't happen. In a real death experience, you have a literal minute-by-minute recreation of your life, drawn up from all these records I was talking about before. You know, I said that there is a record that contains every outcome of every decision you make, which is encoded in the 0 point field digitally. The 0 point field is an energy field we know that exists, that seems to be the backdrop of everything. Okay? So the energy field contains all this information. So you start living your life again. So imagine the scenario when you're playing a third-person computer game. Okay? And you switch on the game, and there you have the on-screen sprite who's born for the first time, who's drunk the waters of the Lethe and has never known it's lived this life before. Comes to, you're the game player, you guide your on-screen sprite, and it goes into a room, and inside is a monster, and it gets killed. That sprite is dead. However, the game player can start the game again. And they start the game again, and a new sprite exists. Forget it, and that sprite doesn't remember that it's lived the life before, because it's drank the waters of the Lethe in the ancient Greek myth. It starts to go down the corridor, but this time, the game player, the being I call the daemon, which is your higher self, your spirit guide, whatever you want to call it, knows that there's a monster in that room. So it will warn you, it will give you feelings and sensations that you shouldn't go in that room. It might give you precognitive dreams. It might give you inklings. It might give you all these things. And you think, and you're the on-screen sprite. We are all in the game. We are all beings I call eidolons. Eidolons are us in the game, but we all have a daemon that is playing our game, okay? So you run along, and you don't know why you don't want to go in that room, but you don't. You go down a further corridor, and you go into another room, and a monster comes out and it kills you. Bang, you're dead again. You're back to the start. Your daemon now knows that room is dangerous. That room is dangerous. So over a period of many lives, your daemon explores all of your life, explores every opportunity you have makes you make different decisions. So in which case you live many, many lives. The Russian edition, the Russian language edition of my first book was actually called Groundhog Life, A Chronicle of Your Own Immortality, because because Groundhog Life, Groundhog Day, the movie, it's very similar idea. So now, where do déjà vus come in? Well, if you've lived this life many times, there will be part of you that will remember. And sometimes there will be this inkling of a recognition that you've done something before. Now, the official explanation, again, I'm going to start beating up the materialist reductionists here. If you read books on psychology and they explain déjà vu, oh, they've explained déjà vu, apparently. It was explained in 1962 by a guy called Robert Efron, and it's called the visual pathways explanation. And it's the idea that, you know, there's two hemispheres to the brain, right and left hemisphere, dominant, non-dominant hemisphere, and the corpus callosum, which communicates between the two. Each eye, the periphery vision of each eye is processed by a different eye. So your left visual field of your left eye and your right visual field of your right eye is processed by one hemisphere and vice versa. It means that both hemispheres have stereoscopic vision. The argument is that the signal is delayed and comes in to the non-dominant hemisphere first by about 0.5 of a second. And the images are processed and then come across the corpus callosum as the other signal comes through from the other eye, which means you get kind of a double memory. You kind of feel, oh, I've done this before. Does not explain precognitive déjà vus, which I know take place. So that cannot explain that. But it only works for vision. There's been research done at the University of Leeds in the UK by a Japanese-English guy called Akira O'Connor. And Akira O'Connor has shown that people who are born blind, they've never had any sight, they have something called déjà senti, which is already heard. And they actually hear something and hear it again, just like a déjà vu sensation, because of course déjà vu is already seen. And I argue that that disproves the whole thing. And I call it, the real description is déjà entendu. No, déjà, oh, what's the term? Already lived. Déjà, I can't remember now, but it's already lived. So you've lived your life again. So what you do is you play your game. You're living your life, which is a game that you're playing. And you play that time many, many times, just like Connors in Groundhog Day, the movie, lives that day over and over again. Do you know the movie at all? Okay. So you know in the movie what he does. Do you remember at the start? He realizes he actually becomes a daemon in his own game. He is a daemon. And the daemon knows what he did yesterday. So he uses that information initially for his own benefit, doesn't he? He tries to bed the girl. He finds out all the things that she likes. And then when he takes her out for a meal the next day, he tells her, my favorite music is this. And she goes, my God, it's my favorite music as well. And she falls in love with him. Then he realizes that he needs more than just this. He needs more than the selfish things. So he uses his time then initially he tries to commit suicide, doesn't he? Officially, he tries to commit suicide so many different ways. But then he starts to use his time to learn things. He teaches himself how to play the piano. He teaches himself foreign languages. So suddenly he's growing as a human being. He's becoming more rounded human being. And then he gets to the next stage where he wants to do good for doing good's sake. He runs around the town. He tries to save the little boy who's falling out of the tree. He does all these wonderful things. He saves the old lady. He tries to save the tramp. And what he's doing over this period of time is he's becoming a more and more perfect human being. He's evolving. He's evolving as a human being. And he's evolving as a human being for one reason. Because I believe after a myriad of lives, you then move on. You live the perfect life and you become an avatar. You become a bodhisattva. And when you do that, you become at one with the universe. Because we're here to learn. We are in this simulation in order to realize two things. To realize that we are one singular consciousness experiencing itself subjectively. That the universe itself, we are the universe and the universe is us. You and I are the same being. We are all the same being. But we embody ourselves and we suffer from something that Plato called amnesis, forgetfulness. When you live your life many, many times, you have anamnesis, which is the loss of forgetting. And suddenly you realize that and then you become your own daemon. And then you can choose to either go back into the simulation to help others with your knowledge, or to move on to the greater spiritual stage where you become part of the greater oneness, which is everything. And now I genuinely believe this makes sense, and it explains every single unusual phenomenon, from precognition to out of the body experiences. I can explain absolutely everything. Now, what is interesting is I'm speaking in California at the end of May at an event in Palm Springs. And the people who were running the event had invited me along because they'd heard about me, but they didn't know a great deal about me. And literally 2 days ago, the owner of the event read my book, The Daemon, and it has blown her mind to such an extent. She was desperate to talk to me. And she said, I need to speak to you. And she spoke to me 2 days ago. And she said, I cannot believe what you're saying. She said, it's the most uncanny and most perfect explanation of my whole life. Because her daemon has been manifest in her life all her life. Because I believe that certain people, the daemon talks to them. I believe that there's some people who have temporal lobe epilepsy, people who have migraine, people who have Alzheimer's. And in my book, the Opening the Doors of Perception, I do the neurology of this. I do the neurology again of how these things take place. So again, everything I've been telling you at the moment, people will be out there going, oh crap, it's ridiculous. The guy's a nutter. Everything I do is based on science. In my books, as you know, everything is cross-referred to academic papers. I always say to my readers, extraordinary claims need extraordinary proofs. It's not my phrase. It was a phrase by Marcelo Trui many, many years ago. But the idea is I make sure and I allow my readers to come to their own conclusions. Don't take my word for it. You read the papers. You read about the planaria worms. You read about the fact that they have no brains. How can you then accommodate within your worldview the fact that a brain cannot exist, but somebody can still function? You have to accommodate these. You can't take certain things out of the equation. If we are going to explain the human condition and how the universe works, we can't just pretend that precognition doesn't happen. We can't pretend that synchronicities don't happen, because they are all part of the evidence. We have to take all the evidence, then we see the whole picture, and then suddenly we make sense. The problem is, though, if we all then make sense and we all realize we're in a simulation, what happens to the simulation? Because suddenly it's like the Matrix, and suddenly we're all Neo or Morpheus, and suddenly we know what's happening. And I think it's not going to happen because the vast, vast majority of humanity are still sleeping. The vast majority of humanity, however much I speak to them, they do not want to know. They are not interested. I can give them absolute evidence, but they will still be in denial. They will still refuse to see it. And I don't know if you guys find the same, you know, that.
Yeah. So it is something, I mean, when I think about like living all these lives, you know, and towards like an evolution, like Barbara Marx Hubbard would say, like it would be towards more evolution, more freedom, and more love. And so eventually maybe people start waking up, but that could take like millions of years, which maybe won't happen. We don't know, but definitely not in this lifetime. It doesn't seem like it, right? And so, yeah, I think Ivra's gonna ask the last question.
Yeah, well, this has been an amazing interview, Anthony. Really, thanks so much. Before we say goodbye, we would like to ask you a couple of questions. Being inside this simulation, what's Anthony Peake's mission? And what things do you still have to achieve or investigate?
Oh, so much. It's untrue. I find that as soon as I open a door into a new room, I discover lots more doors that I have to follow. I tend to now go with where my daemon guides me. I tend to listen to the little voice in the head. And also, I tend to now listen to the people that are coming into my world. I mean, you guys are now in my world. You're now part of it. You know, one of the things I'll say to both of you is, all your life has been a series of coincidences to get you to this moment here now.
Yeah.
Isn't it? Everything. And we are building up this world group, this international movement, which is getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And we're all linking with each other. and we're all cross-fertilizing each other's ideas. And I now meet with people on a regular basis, and we have discussions like this, you know, we'll have a cup of coffee and we spend a whole afternoon discussing these things. And somebody will say something and we'll all go, yeah, that's where we need to go. And we'll follow that. And we feel that we are literally being led. It sounds like some kind of like this kind of crazy guidance thing, but it's more subtle than that. You know, it's more, there's a reason. And if we have all lived this life before, we've all come together because we've done this before, isn't it? It's logical to conclude that your daemon remembers last time this discussion and wants to get you to that point to make sure you don't miss out on this discussion as you did last time. And my daemon is the same. Now I'm 66 in April. So I know I've only got so many years left where my brain will be able to continue doing what I can do. So what I'm doing is I'm building up now, and there's younger and younger people are getting involved in my work. It used to be the case that it was people around my age, but it's not now. There are people in their 20s and their 30s who are getting very involved in this, who really want to carry it forward. We're also trying to set up possibly an organization whereby people can join, and we can have we'll have a magazine, and we can have podcasts and everything else as well. I've also started, I don't know if you've noticed, I've now started doing Facebook Live.
Yeah.
So every month I'll do a Facebook Live posting, and whenever I interview people for my podcast, it goes out live. So people are buying into that. It's amazing. It's got around by word of mouth, and yet within 2 hours of the last podcast, there was 3,000 people had watched it within 2 hours. And that was with no advertising, no anything. It was just word of mouth and people saying, you really need to listen to this. And we had on the show James Orak, who's one of the world's leading authorities on 5-MeO-DMT. And James, some amazing stuff that James was talking about 5-MeO-DMT. Some of the guests we've got coming forward in the next few months are going to be extraordinary. And we are learning all the time. We're learning together. And that's why it's wonderful to have the opportunity to talk to you guys in Mexico, because, you know, I've got one book in Spanish, but we want more. And the only way we're going to be able to do that is to get the message out there. You know, more people need to know about this, because once people, and I find that what people do is that they'll read my book and it sometimes doesn't click, or they'll read my books and it doesn't click. And I see sometimes the little light will go on and somebody will go, oh my God, that's what you mean. I'd never realized before. Oh my God, shit, that is just the most amazing thing I've ever heard. And I just feel happy for that, because I'm not a guru. I'm nobody special, and I'm not. And people who know me know that I'm not. I'm just a fortunate guy that seems to, I seem to have this very strange memory where I don't tend to forget things, and I'm then able to pull them together afterwards and think, oh yes, I read that in 1968. And yeah, I now know why I read that, because that now is important to me and I can now make that linkage. And because I don't restrict myself to any one area of academic research, you know, I can go into the quantum physics, I can go into the neurology, I can go into the neurochemistry, I can go into the esoteric background to things, I can go into the psychology. I'm a sociologist by background and a qualified psychometrician, so I can bring those things in. And I can pull them all together and see the dots that other people don't see. That doesn't make me special. It makes me fortunate. It doesn't make me special. But what it means is that we are all spinning off now, and people are following up on things. There are people wanting to do PhD theses on my work. There's other people wanting to write books on my work and wanting to write books. People are doing music on it. People are writing poetry on it. There's even a guy in Canada that's got a line of underwear based upon it. I don't know quite how that works, but he did. Interesting. Yeah.
Well, it's great, and we hope to, if you are in Mexico anytime, we would love to have you meet the community of MindSurf. There's a lot of people interested in all your work over here, and we would definitely like to have like really good conversations with you. I think it would be.
I would love to do that. The thing is, my plan is to try and get out and about as much as I possibly can, and interface with as many people as I possibly can. And I love traveling anyway, so that would be no problem to me. And I've never been to Mexico. I've been invited. I've been invited to speak in Brazil sometime later this year. by the guys in Florianopolis, and they have an ayahuasca retreat there.
Oh.
And they've invited me down. Again, they're all sort of postdoctoral guys. They're all incredibly bright and doing some fascinating research down there as well. So, but it would be wonderful.
Yes, we would love to invite you over here. So thank you so much for the interview, for your time and all of it. And we're excited to see what comes next.
No, the honor is mine, because you've invested time in inviting me. So that's the thing. It's me that should be thanking you, not the other way around.
Thank you. And so one last question before I forget. Where can people find you? Where can people Right. Okay. In terms of, if you just Google me, Anthony Peake, you will find tons of material there. If you go onto YouTube and put in Anthony Peake, you will find lots of material there. I mean, we haven't even touched upon my work with the lucid light device and the hypnagogic light device, which is incredible what we're doing in terms of that. If you want to find me, I'm on Facebook as Anthony Peake. Also, I've recently started, and this is quite important, guys, if you can really help me on this. I've recently started on Instagram, and I'm Cheat the Ferryman 54. And I need to get, I've only been on there about a month or so, maybe 2 months, but I need to get to 1,000 so I can actually broadcast using Instagram as well. Now, if you can join me on there, again, there's a link on my Facebook page. There's a link. There's Facebook pages for all my books. Each book has its own Facebook page. And there's also a Facebook page now for the Anthony Peake Consciousness Hour as well. So when this goes out, I'll post this everywhere as well, so people can link in with this as well. And I've checked out your Facebook site, so I know your Facebook wall as well, and I've linked in with that as well. So I'll make sure as many people as possible come in and listen to you guys as well. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Anthony.
Okay.
And again, if you ever come to Mexico, please let us know. We will be more than happy to arrange a conference for you, whatever.
One other thing, yes, before I forget, there's 2 other things. My books, you can order them in normal bookshops, and they are found in many bookshops. Also, you can order signed copies of my book off my website, which is anthonypeake.com, if you wish to. My books, I've just finished doing my 3rd book on Audible as well. So there's 3 of my books will be out in Audible version as well, and they're on Kindle and everything else as well. So check them out and let them know, that this is here. But let's keep the debate going. And I would love to come over. And if we could get a conference together, that would be absolutely fantastic.
For
okay,
sure.
guys? Okay, thank you very much.
Thanks
Thank you
again,
so much.
Anthony.
Thank
Have
you.
a good day.
Bye-bye. And you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.